In this lecture, we'll be talking about rough drafts. Now, the first thing I think we need to do is to emphasize the purpose of a rough draft, right? The point of a rough draft is not, oh, this is easy. I can just kind of throw this together and put off writing the actual paper. No, it's not. The purpose of a rough draft is to write like a complete paper with everything in it, total, the best you can. So that way I can critique it. That way I can look at it and say, okay, these are ways to make it better. But I'm struck at how many times I'll receive rough drafts that are incomplete. And I think the kind of mindset is, well, it's just a rough draft, right? I don't really need to try. I can just kind of throw something together. If it's not done, that's fine. But remember, the purpose of a rough draft is primarily for me to be able to read it and give you feedback to make it better. And if it's not already the best you can do, there's not really a whole lot I can say. And if parts are missing, well, I can't really say anything about them, right? So it's important that you work hard on your rough draft that is a complete full draft. Now, we also have to emphasize that research and writing, which of course you need to do in order to write a actual rough draft, are skills. I want to stress these are things you learn how to do by doing them. You learn how to read better by reading. You learn how to be a better writer by writing. I remember when I took the equivalent of History 201, when I was an undergraduate, the professor told me, you write like a Hoosier talks. Hoosier, someone from Indiana. This is at Indiana University. I'm from Indiana. And it's not a compliment to be told that you write like a Hoosier talks. But of course, it makes sense that I would write like I speak. But of course, those things are different, right? The spoken language is different from the written language. So it's important that you learn to write, and you learn to write by practice, right? It's a skill that you learn by repetition, and skills are inherently painful. It's boring. It hurts. It's not exciting. Think about the amount of times, for example, that a basketball player might shoot free throws and just keep shooting them and shooting them and shooting them. Or the number of times a baseball player has to field grounders. It's incredibly boring. It's incredibly tedious. But the key thing is, by enduring that pain, you're developing that skill, and it gets easier and easier and easier to the point you can do it without thinking. So all these things, and this is, I think, what makes skills-based class difficult, is it's hard. But the key thing is, by going through all this work, all this pain, you get better. Now, I think I'm not a big fan of the comic strip The Born Loser. I don't think it's very funny, but I thought this was hilarious. Wilberforce, your report is too long and rambling. With proper planning, you could have been more concise. Sorry, Miss Crabtree, I would have written a shorter report, but I didn't have the time. And I thought that was pretty clever. But basically, the idea is that a lot of times papers that are too long, it's not that they're good, it's that the person just wrote a bunch of junk down that often was just unconnected to each other or even to the thesis. Clear, concise writing is is harder than long, rambling writing. And you've probably have talked to someone or had a teacher who really didn't know what they were talking about, but could talk forever, even though they didn't know anything. And then you've probably also known people who you can ask a very complex question, and they can boil it down and answer it in just a minute or two. You can see the difference in how knowledge and actually knowing the subject allows us to communicate it more clearly and concisely. So it's key, like I said, even though it's just a rough draft, it's not just a rough draft, right? You need to write well, and that means starting early on it, right? And I have lots of little assignments to help people do that. But the key thing is to write clearly and concisely. You have to research so you know what you're talking about. And you have to write, and write early so that you can revise it, right? Rough draft doesn't mean I can just throw something together and hand it in. No, you should have checked your rough draft multiple times before you actually submit it. Ideally, you'd have someone else look at it first before you submit it. Now, I think we need to also talk a little bit about how people think writing works. Typically, people think writing a paper, like a history paper, works this way. You do some research, and then you write the paper. And then you're done. This is a more accurate model. You do some research. You write a bit, realize there's areas where you need to do more research. So you do more research. You then write more. You realize your current question doesn't quite work, so you tweak it a bit. That question now works better, but requires more research. So now you conduct more research. You write more. The paper's better, but it needs more work. This is what I mean by early writing. This is why you want to get started early, because as you come into contact with the research, the primary sources, the secondary sources, you may realize you need to tweak things a little bit, and you go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So research and writing are not separate processes. They're in a dialectic. They're talking to each other. You go back and forth and back and forth. So that's something to keep in mind. I also need to note something called blank page psychology. It is so hard to start writing a paper. And I think in part it's because people try and write their paper from the beginning. Don't write a paper from the beginning. Don't start with your introduction. Don't start with the background. You don't know what the background information needs to be anyway because you haven't written the paper yet. You start somewhere else. And if you just can't think where to start with a primary source. Primary sources are key, central, the heart of good historical research. So start typing notes from your primary source and start analyzing it, and then things will just flow naturally. So you wrote notes on a primary source, copy, paste those into a document, save it as your rough draft, and then start writing based on your notes. That makes things a lot easier. Now, one thing I am going to talk now about my own experience with drafts a little bit to kind of give you an idea of how these things can work and how they can be complex. But first of all, I want to note something about peer-reviewed journals. As a kind of review, peer-reviewed journals are academic journals where articles are not printed unless other academics, other scholars have said that the article can be printed. So, for example, I'll occasionally be asked, hey, we want to print this article for our journal. It's an area that you study. Can you please have a look at it and tell us if you think that this article should be printed or not? And so I'll read it and I'll give my comments and I'll say, well, yeah, you can print it, or, well, it can be printed, but the author needs to make these changes, or don't print this thing, it's terrible. And then I have to give comments. Now, the reverse is also true. Whenever I submit an article, I also get back comments telling me how I need to revise the article if I want it to be printed. And boy, can these comments be painful. And it hurts. Sometimes people don't understand what you're trying to do. Other times they're quite right, and that there's problems with your paper, and you maybe thought, hey, this is a pretty good paper, and they show how, no, it's not actually that great, or hey, it's got these problems, and you're going to have to do more research to fix it. So it's very painful. And I know that when students get comments, some people are really hurt by the comments. They're like, oh my gosh, I thought I wrote a good paper, and the professor says it's terrible, but what am I going to do? Everything's awful. And, I want to say things aren't that bad. Papers and other things get better through criticism. Right? And you're students, you're here to learn. Of course, you're not going to do things perfectly. If you were doing things perfectly, you wouldn't need school, right? So I want to go through some comments I got about the Father Capon paper, right? I've referred to this paper I wrote about Father Capon. He's the Catholic priest who was a POW in a Chinese prison camp during the Korean War, and he died there. And I looked at him and masculinity. So here are some comments I got back when I submitted that article. The problem we see in it, my paper, is that it reads like a hagiography. If you're not familiar with the term hagiography, it means the life of a saint, which talks about how awesome the saint is. Particularly problematic is your discussion of his life before he became a priest. That's the sort of thing that would be part of the biography of a saint, but you really don't show the relevancy of his early life to the masculinity of his priesthood, and that's what an academic paper would require if you want to talk about his early life. Okay, so it was saying I was too positive, basically. I made this guy too saintly. So I tried to deal with that as best I could. In my defense, right, everyone said good things about him, so it was hard to say anything too negative about him, but I found some things. So to continue, a more serious problem is a failure to say more about the concept of masculinity. Besides acting like a father would by caring for his flock, what else is particularly masculine about him? Is it the fact that he wanted to be a part of the fight against the communists? If that is your argument, you need to explain more about how standing up to the communists defined as masculinity. That would make this a much more interesting paper, linking masculinity to anti-communism in the Cold War period, which you appear to suggest cancels out any possibility about his masculinity arising from his celibacy and his most likely much less salty language. Also, it would help if you said more about concepts of masculinity in the US 1950s and how the good father did and did not meet the criteria for being a real man. This was exactly right. I want to stress this. My reviewer, who I knew, even though you're not supposed to know it, but I could tell by the way they wrote, I know who the person was. This was exactly right. And of course, this hurt in a sense. And I had to go to the library and I had to find some books, and I spent several more hours doing research and revising my paper, but it made the paper much better. So yeah, this hurts, but the idea is it makes things better. So when you read comments, don't take it, oh, this is a personal attack. Don't take it as, oh, geez, this is awful. I'm a terrible scholar. That's not what it's saying. It's saying this is a way you can make your paper better. And this is just part of the fact of life of scholarship is we work together in a community. Everyone makes mistakes. No man, no woman is an island. We just keep going. We take criticism. The stuff we can use, we use. The stuff we can't, we just ignore. And this is the one that really hurt because I thought was unfair. Finally, since our journal is an academic journal, not a parish bulletin, we would like to have seen a more nuanced or at least less hagiographical portrait of Father Capon. This is not a forum to make an argument for his canonization. Instead, this journal likes to print articles that take concrete examples from religious history or religious practice to make an argument about an important issue, such as changing the concept of what makes a real man. It is not the life of Father Capon, but what his life tells us about his time that is important for this journal. I thought this was a little hard on me, to be honest. I thought this was a little bit too critical. I wasn't trying to make an argument for his canonization. It's not my fault that people liked the guy and only said good things about him. But in any case, even though that I think was not 100% fair to me, this part here was 100% spot on. I went to the library, I made the changes, and I responded to my comments, and my paper was published. Right? It became a journal article. So it's important to respond to comments. They make your paper better. Right? They make your paper better. And even if you disagree, at least then you can get a decent grade or, you can get your paper published. But the key thing, I think a big part of going to university, a big part of just being a professional person is learning to take criticism. To have enough confidence that people, when they criticize you fairly, you can make the changes that need to be made. And if they're a little bit unfair that you have thick enough skin, you can just get by it. So for me, I was really depressed for a day. Then I got to work. And you can too.